Hey guys, so in this session we discuss data synthesis using thematic and narrative synthesis for a systematic review. So this is the best explanation you could actually have, and there are practical exercises for you to embark on. So make sure you enjoy the show. Let's go.
To our previous session, or we've had to watch some of the things we've done in our previous session. We've talked about almost all the domains of a systematic review. We've started from overview down to the method of data synthesis technically. And today we're going to be discussing something very distinct, something very phenomenal, and that's going to be something on the qualitative aspect of systematic review. Last week we did mention about the meta-analysis, where we talk about the meta-analysis being the quantitative aspect. We talked about stuff like the some of the effect measures in meta-analysis. We did discuss in length how you can perform a meta-analysis, using several effect measures like the odds ratio, the risk ratio, knowing when to use which effect measure, and the model, when are you going to use a fixed model and all that. But in our session today, we're going to be talking about the narrative and thematic synthesis. There are a lot of approaches that you can use in doing your systematic review synthesis, and narrative synthesis is one of them, as well as thematic synthesis. And these are approaches that are synonymous to the qualitative approach for your synthesis. Now, as usual, we're going to have our outline. We're going to start by talking about what is qualitative synthesis. Then we're going to discuss some of the key terms that are affiliated to this. Then we'll look at narrative synthesis, the process of narrative synthesis, and we'll have a look at some of the tools that you can use in performing your narrative synthesis. Also, we'll look at what thematic synthesis entails and the tools as well, because sometimes we're going to see some of the differences as well between the narrative and the thematic synthesis. Then our practical section today is going to automate by us performing our qualitative synthesis using AI to like ChatGPT. We're going to show how we can use ChatGPT to perform our detailed narrative synthesis, and also it's very imperative for you to understand some of the benefits and limitations of this AI automation in performing your qualitative synthesis. Then also, we're going to look at some of the steps in performing narrative and thematic synthesis. Then we'll take a summary and practice exercises. So we're going to jump straight into the lecture. Now, when we talk about qualitative synthesis, what comes to your mind? A lot of things comes to your mind. Usually in research, we usually explain quantitative and qualitative research, where we do always mention that for your quantitative research, it entails any type of research question that answers, questions, any type of, just when you're talking about your quantitative research, you're technically looking at any form of research that is answering any question that deals with numerical facts. You're not trying to know how much effect, how many. These are some of the numerical attributes that comes with the quantitative research. Now, but what point are we trying to make here? When it comes in terms of qualitative research, we're more focused with, we're not just focused with numbers now, but we're more interested with opinions, ideas, more of why and all that. Now, how does synthesis now come in place? So it means that for you to perform your synthesis now, you need to do what? You need to qualitize those information, because most times when we are going to be looking at diverse papers, we might not be able to really pick out all those numbers to pull them together, just like how we showed in a meta-analysis paper. But now, in terms of a qualitative synthesis now, it's going to be more of us now going through the patterns and themes that we find in those papers. And that is why qualitative synthesis now is just like a method that we use to summarize and interpret findings from qualitative studies. And this is where we focus more on understanding some of the themes and the patterns and some of the insights that are in those papers. Because we're not just, let's say, for example, we're looking at the study like prevalence of malaria. We're not just looking at the data on prevalence now. It can now be something on the experiences of mothers towards probably malaria, something, right? In that situation, we are taking patterns, themes on experiences, and these things are not quantitative attributes, rather they are what? qualitative attributes. So when we talk about qualitative synthesis, what we're interested in is we're trying to summarize or interpret findings from what? Qualitative studies. Okay? Now, the question now becomes, why is qualitative synthesis important? Because it's very important. Before we start diving into some of the key approaches, we need to know why is it important. Unlike a numerical synthesis where you have to just pull on the overall effect of what you've already gotten from the data, in qualitative synthesis is now important because it gives us a more bigger picture, right? It provides a richer understanding of the complex phenomena, that we are trying to explore. Because if numerical attributes, we will just only pick on the data, but in terms of qualitative, we now need to now understand other certain factors that we can just really draw from a numerical standpoint. And that is why qualitative synthesis is one that provides a very massive picture for our research. And just like we did mention at the beginning of this lecture, we made it very clear that some of the two key approaches that we're going to be looking at is going to be the narrative synthesis and the thematic synthesis, and that is just what it is. Because we're going to start from taking it one after the other. We'll look at some of the domains of the narrative synthesis. What is required of you in doing this narrative synthesis? And for the thematic synthesis, what is required of you in doing the thematic synthesis? And that's going to be the building point of our lecture today. Now, this is actually a very beautiful picture. If you're listening, it's what I just projected on the screen. It's like it's just an image that tries to show what narrative synthesis looks like. Textual summary. We've got bits of ideas that we are trying to match up together and synthesize them, and that is just what narrative synthesis is all about. And it's just what it looks like. This image was actually just generated for a very more brighter understanding of what narrative synthesis is going to look like. So we're just going to take all these pinches together, merge them together, and come up with a richer picture. Remember that in qualitative synthesis, we did mention that it provides a richer understanding of a complex phenomenon. So in this case now, some of what you're seeing here now could be the word complex dots. So we're going to just merge them together and have our richer picture. So moving forward, there are certain terms we need to understand, which we did mention, the key terms that will be very pertinent for us to get or lay our hands on. And one of them is a narrative synthesis. What is a narrative synthesis? Narrative synthesis is just it's something that, or it's a process that combines textual descriptions to summarize and explain findings across the studies. So we're also going to show examples of what some of this seems to be. And we're going to really explain it because I think in our last session we did explain it when we started explaining data synthesis and research. We did show some of the examples of meta-analysis, narrative synthesis, and thematic synthesis. And for narrative synthesis, it is one that focuses on relationship between studies. So it just tries to look at some of the relationships between the studies, explore their similarities and their differences. Another key term that we're going to look at is the thematic synthesis. And the thematic synthesis is one that identifies, analyzes, and interprets some of the themes or patterns across the study. So many a times, what it implies is that it aims to develop new insights or frameworks from quantitative. So we're definitely going to have a detailed, example of what this entails. But what you need to take home now at this point of you understand the key terms is that for your narrative synthesis, you're more like combining textual data. So most times you can actually have more like a quantitative study and a qualitative study together. Then you want to combine both of them. It can happen in narrative synthesis, but in terms of the thematic synthesis, they must all be qualitative studies where you want to do what? Interpret those themes or patterns across them. So it's going to aim to develop new insights or frameworks from the qualitative data. And for the themes here, we need to understand that it's more like a recurring ideas or concepts identified in data. So example is an emotional burden in caregiving study. So we're going to also have a detailed understanding of this in our practicals, and it's going to be something very, very interesting for us to lay our hands on. And another idea that we're going to get with is coding, because before you start your thematic synthesis, Many a times you need to do what, code them and label and categorize your data into meaningful groups. And this is something that is what very, 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 very pertinent. So moving ahead now, where does this lead us to? It leads us to understanding that for us to develop, for us to start our narrative synthesis process, the first thing we need to look at is we need to develop a preliminary synthesis. First of all, we need to have a table which shows the characteristics of the included studies, which we've already explained in our previous session. That is largely when we're performing our data extraction, where we summarize the findings of each study. We use tables, graphs, sometimes also textual summaries to organize the information. Then we need to now explore the relationships between the studies, and that is one thing that is very pertinent. We're also going to demonstrate that in our AI automation for our narrative synthesis. And what we do here is we start by identifying the connections, contradiction, or gaps in the findings, which is going to also form part of our detailed prompts. And we also need to group the studies based on similarities, some sort of settings, populations, and all these are fundamentals of our teams. Whenever we're performing our narrative synthesis, it's very largely very relevant for us to make sure we match them up to our teams and get those what's done. And also, another thing we need to understand is that we need to also assess the robustness of the findings. We need to do assess the robustness of the findings, which is evaluating the quality and reliability. So these are some of the things we explained in our risk of bias, where we can use frameworks like the critical appraisal script program form and all that. So while we are discussing this in our studies together narratively, these are some of the elements we need to consider. We need to consider some of textual summary. We need to understand the relationship between the studies and in line with our teams. Then we need to also understand the quality of the studies. So these are very fundamental whenever we are discussing our synthesis. Now, it leads us to the next stage, which is to know the tools for performing our narrative synthesis. And this is something that is very, very vital. And that is where we need to understand that some of the tools for narrative synthesis incorporates Excel, NVivo, for the Cochrane guidance and all that. And Excel, what we use Excel for, remember in our data extraction session, we did explain that we can use Excel for data selection, we can use it for studies, we can use it in our screening process, we can use it in also extracting those relevant information that can help us providing the summary. So that is a very massive tool for us in our synthesis, because that is where we can actually pick up some relevant findings from our abstract and make so much of sense in it. And the NVivo is also another tool that is used largely for our qualitative synthesis, where we manage textual data and identify recurring things. And these are some of the things we do, using our the NVivo software. And the Cochrane guidance also helps us to structure, some of our qualitative synthesis. So these are some of the tools that are very pertinent. There are also lots of tools out there that you can use in your narrative synthesis. Like I said, towards the end of this lecture, we're going to explore how we can use the ChatGPT, which is a generative tool to organize our texts in our narrative synthesis. I'm just going to have a practical example of what it means and what it means for us to get started in our narrative synthesis. So an example there could be more like analyzing studies on the impact of community health interventions, where we can group the findings into things like awareness, participation, and outcome. So all these things are things we really need to take detailed account into before we get started. Oh, does it end there? No, exactly. So for next is going to be our thematic synthesis. So what's the thematic synthesis process all about? So if you're hearing about the thematic synthesis for the first time, don't worry. We're going to also show a detailed example of what that looks like. And remember, in our thematic synthesis process, we are looking at the first process there is to code the data. We need to get the data coded. And more of what we do there is we need to read through the studies findings and assign codes to each keeper. So that means when we pick each of the included studies, let's say, for example, we have 5 included studies. When we pick each one, we read through it, some of the findings in the studies, in the results, then we can actually assign codes to some of the key things that has been talked about in that paper. We're also going to do what? We're also going to demonstrate how we can actually use AI to automate that, to make that faster and more efficient. And also some of these things could be coding, like maybe sometimes in the study that is looking at isolation and emotional well-being, you might pick out codes like feelings of isolation, you can also pick out stuff like emotional well-being. It could also be other things like trauma and all that. So these are some of the codes that we need to start by doing what? Picking out. Then it is not when we are now done picking it out that we can now group all these codes to create a broader descriptive theme. So we can combine those codes. For example, now they will code on isolation and loneliness into a theme like what? Emotional challenges. And then when we now generate the analytical themes, we can now interpret some of those descriptive themes now to generate higher level insights. That is where we can now conclude that social support networks migrate and mitigate emotional challenges. And this is where we do our analysis. But here, our codes is something that is going to lead us to the what? To the themes. So all these are just what we need to know about the thematic synthesis process. Now remember that, don't worry, we're going to explain in details. If you're doing your narrative synthesis, one thing you need to get in mind is that when you have included studies that are, let's say, for example, your included studies are quantitative studies and qualitative, and also some method of mixed method studies, then you can use your what? Your narrative synthesis, which is here, right? But if your studies are strictly qualitative studies where you need to pick out some of these codes that have been used inside of these primary studies for systematic review, then it is very pertinent for you to understand that the thematic synthesis process, it's going to be the best and it's going to be the eligible synthesis for you to use. Are there other syntheses? Yes, we've got some of them like content analysis and a wide range of them. Now there's a software we call the NVivo, which we explained earlier as well. It's also used for thematic synthesis as well, where we facilitate the coding, we categorize it, and we generate the theme. I also have the software which we also know as, we refer to as the atlas.ti, which helps us to see some of the relationships between the codes and the themes. Excel also helps us very well in our thematic synthesis. It's also very, very vital to in our thematic synthesis because it's just like it tells us to to group our data into teams, and also it helps us from the coding because it gives us that powerful advantage as a visualization tool where we can actually see all the information from the included study. So if you've looked at our session on that extraction, you actually get to understand in details what I am saying. So synthesizing studies on caregiver experiences into themes like emotional support needs, financial strain, and coping mechanisms. So we're going to see this a whole lot of time in our practice for our synthesis. Now the question now comes up now is, we've talked so much about narrative synthesis and thematic synthesis, but then what are the differences between narrative synthesis and thematic synthesis? And this is where we now try to look at this from some of these criteria of or aspects of like focus, data type, output, an example. Now, for example, in the narrative synthesis, like I said, it's just like a textual summary. So it can actually involve both quantitative and qualitative studies. And it's just more like a story-like explanations, trying to talk about connections and all that. And example is just like we want to summarize community health intervention. Maybe let's say we have the systematic review on community health interventions for malaria. Some of them might be quantitative studies, like cross-sectional studies. Some of them might be a grounded theory design. In that situation, we can actually combine them as included studies and then summarize them textually. This is the massive difference between the narrative synthesis and thematic synthesis. In the narrative synthesis, we can combine both qualitative and quantitative studies in our summary while we are discussing the themes. Unlike in a thematic synthesis, where we're trying to identify, in our focus, we're trying to identify and interpret themes, right? And it's primarily when we have included studies that are qualitative studies. And again, is the output is just like a framework of a thematic map, where we are now seeing some of the themes of the experience of what those participants are actually giving. And an example is just like identifying themes in caregiver experiences. unlike in the narrative synthesis where we are doing more like a summary. So what is the take-home idea here? The take-home idea here is that anytime you're stuck performing a meta-analysis and you're finding out that some of the studies are having so many different heterogeneous outcomes, then a narrative synthesis can step in. Anytime you're having a mixture of several data, and some of them are qualitative, some of them are quantitative, but addressing a particular research question, then you can use a story-like connection, like a narrative synthesis, to do what? To address that. And the same thing was, the same thing doesn't apply to a thematic synthesis. It's contrary to thematic synthesis, where you have to use what? Only qualitative studies. Remember, what if we are to bring in a meta-analysis here? A meta-analysis focus is only going to be for what? Quantitative findings. The data type is going to be primarily quantitative only in terms of bringing a meta-analysis in here now. And the output is going to be more like what? It's going to be only more of effect estimate. And an example could be what? Prevalence of what? Drug usage in what? In a community in Nigeria or in a community in Saudi Arabia. So the idea or the key take-home point here now for you to understand is that what? In a meta-analysis, it is primarily what? Quantitative. But in a narrative synthesis, it is qualitative and what? Quantitative. Sometimes it can also be quantitative alone, but here you're just textualizing. It can also be qualitative alone, but maybe you want to just textualize it, right? Maybe the patterns are not really similar, so you can textualize it. It can mix methods. So narrative synthesis is that bridging block that tries to help us to synthesize both what? It can help us in synthesizing a mixed method of study. So that makes it very, very clear. Now we'll have to now jump into understanding how to do the AI automation. Now, how can we use AI to actually automate our textual analysis? Tools like ChatGPT, BET, or Grok, if you're watching in the future, can help us in textual summarization, because summarizing study abstracts into key findings. We can also use AI assisted coding, like in vivo with AI plugins to automate, our coding and categorization of our text, and also we've got lots of examples out there that we can actually use in getting our pattern recognition, so that can help us in grouping our studies together. So these are some of the ways that AI can actually help us in getting started. And AI also, it is very pertinent for us to know that it has its benefits and also limitations, which it saves times in automating, and so it reduces human error in data organization, and it enhances some of the scalability by processing large data sets. And again, we need to always do what? Cross-check our data appropriately in terms of what? Because sometimes it must require what? Manual verification to get things started. So remember, just like we talked about in the process, to get our narrative synthesis, to get started with it, what we need to do is to gather those data from the included study. Then we create tables or summaries for each of those studies. We compare the findings across the studies to identify patterns. We summarize, we present the findings in a cohesive narrative, and we get that. So we're going to explain this now in details in our practical. Same also applies here. We import the data to in vivo, we code them, assign labels to each of them. We cluster some of the similar codes into descriptive team. We do our generation of our analytical teams, which I already explained in details. And then we try to present the findings in teams or map. An example is maybe trying to understand the team in a study or psychological impact of living with chronic pain. So we're going to actually have this practice now in Jiffy. So to get us started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to return back to our practice text. So remember that we do have our research question that we talked about, that we are already using to work on determinants of teenage pregnancy in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you can recall, in our previous session already, we already discussed in our data extraction how we can get our table on characteristics of included studies. And this was where we chose some of the 3 papers that we find here, these 3 articles. I'm just going to click and open them. Okay. So this is the first article by Ezekiel. Yeah, that's by the first article by Ezekiel. And then also we've also got the second article here by Mvuladu. And also we have the third article here by Kyogo et al. Now remember that ideally, if you can remember in our first session, we did mention that for you to perform a systematic review, you need a minimum of what? 2 studies. You need a minimum of 2 studies, because what is a systematic review? A systematic review is just all about trying to use a systematic process or an organized process to address a particular research question amongst what primary studies. So you want to use an organized process to synthesize findings across what primary studies. And that cannot just be one study. A systematic review cannot be performed with one study. It must be performed by what? 2 or more studies. In a meta-analysis, for you to perform a meta-analysis, you need a minimum of what? 2 studies. So the same thing applies. The minimum you can have is what? 2 studies. And using 2 studies might affect the plausibility. So it means that the more included studies you have, the more it increases the what? The quality of the evidence. Because the more studies, the more sample size, technically, we usually mention in our primary research, the more participants we have participating in our study, the more it improves the quality of the evidence and all that. So that is for that. Now, for us to get started, so now these are the 3 included studies that we have for our what? So that we need to use in addressing our question on what? Determinants of what? Teenage pregnancy. So I'm going to come down here. I've already inserted all the relevant information. So I'm going to call this part the synthesis. Now, for the sake of this session, I'm going to be using the narrative synthesis. Now, remember, the first thing you do in discussing in your meta-analysis, not in your meta-analysis, the first thing you do in your synthesis is to first of all explain the method of synthesis you need to use. And one thing that is very ideal in your manuscript, if we're going to have a sample of what we're going to be doing is going to look like, we're just going to hover in here. We'll go over to our first lecture on our data synthesis. We did show examples. Now, when we open our article that we published on correlative, this was on correlative study on body mass index and blood pressure. When you hover around this article, you find out that in terms of the results, we have our characteristics of included studies, and the next thing that follows is our risk of bias, then our narrative or synthesis. So if you look at our narrative synthesis here, we are just exploring some of the findings in line with some of the potential topics or titles that we've used. And this is what is usually similar to your narrative synthesis. Now, if you're going to have a look at what the thematic synthesis also looks like, it's not something so much different from that, because I've already showed you my article of what that could look like. So this is what your thematic synthesis looks like. What we are doing basically in our thematic synthesis, for example, in this study where we're trying to explore the experiences and treatment-seeking behavior of women suffering from postpartum depression in the United States, then the next thing we are looking at here is we're going to when we hover around the results section, and see, the first thing we do is we explain the approach. And we use the Thomas and Harding methods, which I've explained in my previous video. Also, remember we said coding the data. We did mention that. That was the first thing we did mention. Coding, creating descriptive themes, and also constructing the analytical team. You remember that we did mention these 3 steps in our thematic synthesis, and that is what we mentioned here. Coding, we get our descriptive teams and we do our analytical teams. So that's just it. Now back to this. This is what the synthesis is going to look like. Then we have our first team, which is an experiences with mental health service, and we try to explain and draw insights on some of the participants' comments in our write-up. And we have the second team here on perception and attitudes toward mental health interventions. And we have the third team on cultural influences and so forth and so on. Now, what are we going to do now? Now, the next thing we're going to be looking at now is we're going to now move into, now coming into the data synthesis now for our example here on determinants of teenage pregnancy in sub-Saharan Africa. So already, the first thing we would have done here in our data synthesis for our systematic review is to start by explaining the approach. So we're going to say a narrative. Remember, you've already explained this in your method. So you say a narrative synthesis will, or here maybe you say you already, it's no longer a proposal, say was used in forming this systematic. And this started by coding relevant information. No, sorry. So, first of all, you started by one, obtaining the textual summary. Because remember, in our creative synthesis, we are trying to obtain the textual summary from across studies, pattern line, yes, and then we analyzed the relationships. Remember, after getting the textual summary of the study, then represented you find we are then represented method table, and then we discussed the findings using relevant teams was the textual. Okay, so we could make this more proper. So let's make the sentences more correct now. So I'm trying to make this bold so it's clear. Now, analysis was using performing these systematic reviews. I can say was using performing the synthesis. Systematic. This started by obtaining textual summary across the studies. Also, findings were then represented in the detail table. And then we discussed the findings using relevant things. So the first novel based on textual summary. Here the relationship. Now the idea here is that we have gotten the relevant insights that we need in performing our what? Our analytic synthesis. And the first thing we need to consider here is the first thing we perform here is first of all we need to enter the studies. Whenever we want to perform our analytic synthesis, we enter the studies, then we now obtain the teams. Because when we are doing for our AI automation, some of the steps that we're going to use in doing performing our analytic synthesis here is going to be first of all to enter the studies. Then we'll obtain the teams, and we'll discuss the relationship. We enter the studies, we get the summary table of the study findings. Then we now obtain the team, then we discuss the relationship between studies. Things. Now these are some of the things we perform whenever we are doing our when we're going to start our AI automation. So let's get straight into example. And remember, it also similarly applies to the thematic synthesis that you're going to perform if you're using an AI automation. And remember to always cross-check the paper to make sure that all your findings are accurate. So what I'm doing for the narrative synthesis is not also different for the thematic synthesis. Remember, if you're performing the thematic synthesis, I'm trying to explain them line by line. The first thing you're going to do is not different from what I have just done here. You are, in terms of the results, first you have the data extraction table, then which will already explained. Then you have the risk of bias, well detailed. Then you start by explaining the process, the thematic synthesis process. Then you might need to list the codes, list the things that you've obtained. And to get those things is still the same similar way by entering the studies or the qualitative studies that you have. You get a summary table of the study findings, you obtain the teams, and you discuss the patterns. Now, in terms of if it's for, this is what is going to apply for narrative. But if it's going to be for thematic, so this is what it's going to be. For thematic, you enter the studies, you get the summary table findings, you obtain the teams, obtain the codes, then sub teams, then you now discuss teams. I'm treating. And let's look at that. Okay. So this is still the same way that we're going to do it, but a bit slightly different because of the objective of the data synthesis methods approach that we're using. So if we're using a narrative synthesis, which is quite very simple, which we're going to use in our study. Now, we're going to enter the studies. Remember, again, I'll repeat myself, we'll enter the studies, and I'm going to obtain the summary table of the findings. And I'm going to tell you I'm going to also demonstrate how we're going to obtain this, because we already explained this in our data extraction. There are some certain key parameters that we want to extract from the studies findings, which are going to be very relevant. Then we obtain the teams across these findings, then we discuss the relationship between the studies in the teams. Contrary to the thematic synthesis, we enter the studies, we enter the summary table of the study findings. We will have a table regardless. Then we obtain the codes across these studies. Then we obtain the sub-teams and teams. Then we discuss the teams in line with the objective and explore patterns. So these are all the things we need to do. Now we need to get started. Now getting started now means, now somebody might be asking, what is the rationale for us to choose a narrative synthesis in this particular study example that we have? Now, any type of research question can be addressed using any type of research question. Now, in our example here, we have the determinants of teenage pregnancy in sub-Saharan Africa. We can use a narrative synthesis, we can use a meta-analysis depending on the nature of the included studies that we have. But when we have a look at some of these studies that we've included here, right, we'll see that these studies don't really have numerical estimates, right? So when you look at these studies, we don't really have a common numerical estimate that we have here. Also, when we open this paper now, we see that this might be slightly different in terms of the outcome measures. And when we open this is a qualitative study. So these are heterogeneous. They are heterogeneous in terms of their work, in terms of their design. This is using a semi-structured deep interview, whereas this is something that is using a community-based cross-section, so using an interview administered based cross-section. So these are what heterogeneous approach. Now, if you remember here in this slide, I did also mention, when I was talking about the differences, I did mention clearly here that when we are we choose a narrative synthesis when we have qualitative and what quantitative studies, but we use a thematic synthesis when we have primarily what qualitative synthesis. So, okay, now can we now see example of where thematic synthesis has been used? The example is clearly here in this study, and what you will get to realize is that in this study we included 4 studies, and these 4 studies are all what qualitative. So you can take a look at it from the characteristics of the included studies here. Or from this example, we have the study by Paraman, which is what experiences, semi-structured, grounded theory. This is a qualitative approach. Look at the second study here, convenience sampling, and all that. Experiences also is qualitative design. And look at the third one by Iturado et al. Course group discussion. Inductive approach to the qualitative design as well. And look at the last one by Amankwa, qualitative interview things, which is what qualitative design. So when we look at this now table, what do we get to realize? We get to realize that we first of all extracted the core themes codes from these studies, right? From just these included studies. Then after we extracted them, we also did for the second study, we also did also for the third study, and we also extracted that for the fourth study. Then it is now after we are done with this that we can now do what? Combine them into into things. So I'm going to take out the critical appraisal so it's not going to obstruct our view of this. I'm going to take this out. Okay. All right, so this is what we are trying to talk about technically, and when we are now done for the thematic synthesis, we can now show a detailed table how we performed the codes, and that is where we see it here. This is the thematic synthesis. Remember, we talked about the codes, things, and that's it. That's all supporting codes, but we will have to explain this much more in detail. So now let's get back to our example. Cool. So the next thing now, we have our research question, which is on determinants of teenage pregnancy, and we have a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative studies. And meta-analysis is not appropriate because it is not quantitative. They are not all quantitative studies, and the thematic analysis is not also appropriate because they are not all qualitative. So the narrative synthesis was chosen as a best episode. The first thing we're going to do is to enter the studies. And how do I enter that? So I'm going to come here. I'm going to open GBT. I'm going to click on this. So it's just going to lead me there. So to get that started, I'll please select the folder. So I'll find that in here in session 7. So this is article 1. And you remember, you must be using the premium version of this to be able to do that. So I'm just going to show us a clear cut example. So I'm going to enter the second article. So this is the second article, article 2 by M. Vlade. Then I'm also going to enter the third article. Remember, your ability to use AI is something that is going to really make you very, very, very detailed. Now, the first thing, remember that the first thing we said that is going to be our command here is going to be to enter the study, which we have now done. So we can check that with a green box. Now, the next thing is to get a summary table. And now, how do we get a summary table? And what is the appropriate part to get a summary table out of this? Now, one session I will always have with people is how we call using AI safely, how to give detailed prompts, also how to make sure you maintain ethics in terms of your words, in terms of your prompting. And that is what I'm going to do now. And how am I going to get that done? How I'm going to get that done now is by. Now I'm going to give the right prompt. Now, if you remember, when you refer back to our data extraction session in our training, we did mention that when you want to perform your data extraction, there are some relevant items that are imperative for you to extract. Now, just like looking at this study here, if you go to the method section, Now you get to see that there's some certain information that we see that will be extracted, and these are the information. It's usually very key. It is the same information that you want to capture from your what? From the characteristics of your included study. So those information, the data summary table can still be your data extraction with the findings, but depending on how you put the prompt. So what I'm going to say here in detail wise, I'm going to say that is looking at this trade, included studies, extract the following information from these studies in a detailed table with the following columns. So you can refer back to our data extraction study or session to get all the insights that are relevant for you in extracting your study. So the first one is going to be the author and year questions. This column is going to be the title / study. And the third one is going to be the sample size. We need a sample size. That's participant characteristics. Statistics, sure. We need to do the statistics. Then we need in the study design. We need to know the method of data collection. Then also we need to know the then findings for the third. Then the VII was able to know the limitations. These are very important. Remember that we talked about robustness and risk of bias. So if you hover back to a slide here, we did mention that. I'm going to show you still. Robustness of the findings. So that means somehow we need to know the quality of the study. So that's where the limitations actually going to play a role. And then I don't know if I'm missing on any other information, but I think these are some of the information that we really need. And I could just hit that and enter key. And it's going to read that. And you got that. And I got it. Now this is what our summary table. This is what our summary table. Now remember, the next thing you need to do is to make sure you cross-check all this relevant information. Hey, another thing we might want to add is rather than putting limitation, we have study setting, which is also very important, and VII as well. Limitations. So I'm just going to incorporate that again. I'm going to generate that. That's read the papers and get me that data. Okay, cool. So regardless, this is the extracted table, and we have everything technically extracted from the table here. We have the community. We have first of all, we have the study title and author. We have the title and objective. We have the sample size, participant characteristics, 750 adolescent, 192 days, 20 adolescent girls, cross-sectional design, community-based, qualitative design. You can see that's correct. And also we have the main findings and all that. So we have the study setting, all the limitation and all that. And the next thing we're going to do, we're going to come here. So we enter the summary table. So we check that box with green. Now, to obtain the themes, now, first thing we need to do, because I am just teaching the AI automation, normally, usually, the traditional approach that we usually do is to read all these papers. When I read this, I'll go to the results section. I'll check if some of the things that I'm actually obtaining, maybe if I'm reading it here, looking at the determinants. When I read some of the results, I try to look at some of the things that the participants are saying. I can see low income is one of the things, or income status is one of the determinants things that I want to explore. Then I could check out another paper too. What else am I obtaining? What other thing can I find from the results? So technically, I have to read these papers very in details if I'm using the traditional approach of doing my narrative synthesis, or even if it's my thematic synthesis. But what I'm going to do here in this situation is, instead of doing that, I'm also going to remain on that same prompt. The next thing I'm going to ask it is to, now, I'll tell it to, considering that the aim of my study of the review is to determine, is to explore the determinants of teenage pregnancy in sub-African. How to generate 4 teams. Maybe I need 4 teams. There are 4 teams across these studies. So just them. So just like I said, okay, it's just something I said. Some of the 4 things there. We have socioeconomic determinants of educational attachment theory, schooling. We have cultural influence. We have access to. So these are some of the determinants of teenage pregnancy. Then the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to check that box. I'm going to check it. So we have the teams. Okay, let me just highlight that. I'm going to check it. So maybe if I'm not really interested in this, I don't really find it, I'll have to change it. But you have to be very detailed in making your prompt. It has to be really, really very detailed. The next thing is to discuss it. So let's say, for example, these are the themes that I've obtained. So I'm just going to copy that. Let's just Control C there. Then I'll come to my, so this is going to be my synthesis. Then I can just put that in. So for my first theme, remember, so the next thing I'm going to do now is to now discuss these themes. I have to be very exhaustive. Now remember that when we talk about our narrative synthesis here, if we return back to the lecture, since we try to combine textual descriptions to summarize and explain findings across the studies, we focus on the relationship between the studies, exploring similarities and differences. That is what we said. And we also said that we try to identify the connections, contradictions, or gaps in the findings. We group the studies based on similarities, settings, and population. We will try to textualize it. So right in detail. So you have that information. So I'm going to see here using, okay, let's say for example, so no need which citation style do I want to use. Say for example, using Harvard citation and referencing style discussed theme on, I could pick the first one. On socio-economic determinants of health. I think I'm going to increase my screen so it's going to be more clear. Okay, cool. And discuss the theme on socio-economic and family determinants. And that's the study. Okay, we're making it more easy to understand the details. And specific. I would have added and explore relationships all in one long Sorry, I said paragraphs. I'm just a paragraph. So I send it, and that's it. So this first one here, I'm just going to copy that to bring it out of here, keep it here. So we'll keep it before we start our cross-checking. So this is the first insight that we'll have from our. Okay, cool. Then we go into the next one. So that's the next thing that's also going to happen there. So I could just put this. I don't really need to repeat that prompt again. It understands what I want. I just put that to the next one. It understands it. I put the next one. I just put the next prompt. Copy the default. I'm going to put that also. So I'm going to put the fourth one as well. So this is what our AI automation entails and all that. So you need to, this is just a very simple example of how to just get started technically with that. And from what I can see, it looks like all the studies actually have something to say in all the things. But remember that sometimes in this particular team, it can only be 4. Let's say, for example, you included 10 studies. Please note what I'm saying now. Let's say, for example, you included 10 studies. It's possible that in this team, 5 can talk about it. Maybe in this team, 8 can talk about it. In this team, 10 can talk about it. In this team, 3 can talk about it. It's all cool, right? That is what it means. That means it's still a systematic review because you still have that detailed finding from there. So I also, we'll have to just move in these. Then before we start reading it, to cross-check, with what we already have. So this is where I'm going to move in. Also, I'm going to also move in there. And also remember that unless you're doing a critical appraisal, which is not part of our session, you need to sometimes compare your findings with wider literature while you're discussing. It's something that is very important, but that doesn't really form the basis of this session. But what we just need to understand here now is how to do everything technically. And so I've just put in all those information that we need. And this area. So this is what it looks like for the first team. Got that. We check it. So when we take up the first team, the study by Abedin did highlight that this, and that. Similarly, this guy identified this. So this correlation suggests that limited this, and that, and all that. So this is, remember we talk about what? Establishing a relationship between the studies in the team. And that is it. So it tries to also explore how this guy talk about in another context, this guy talk about this. So we'll move on to the next thing. In terms of educational attainment and other, so the review studies review strong association between this. This guy also showed that this guy dropped out from this. Remember, all these things are going to be very, very possible when you've carefully selected your studies. So study selection is a very, very, very relevant part. You must make sure you select the appropriate studies for your synthesis. So something for cultural and social influences, and something also for here. So thank you very much for that. For in terms of your thematic synthesis, it's still the same process, similar prompts that I just gave here. You have all your qualitative studies, you put them in, you enter the study, you get the table of findings, it asks you to get the code in a detailed across studies. Then you attend the sub-teams, you discuss it and explore patterns. So it's still something that you cross-check properly and thoroughly to make sure everything is well detailed. And remember, we are still ongoing there. So the next thing there is going to, after there is, what are some of the summary key points that we need to take away today? So in summary, all we need to know is that narrative synthesis is best whenever we're trying to textualize or summarize diverse studies, using textual explanation, right? Maybe if the studies are heterogeneous, then a narrative synthesis is appropriate. And for thematic synthesis is ideal for generating insights from qualitative data by identifying recurring themes. And like we said, some of the tools that we need is we need to use Excel, InVivo, AI plugins like ChatGPT can also help us. And that. Remember, AI enhances the speed, but you need to do what's called check it. You still need to go through the papers to be sure that everything that it's reporting is appropriate. So I will want you to start your own synthesis. So you've got your own choosing studies. So just generate some of the things and actually get those things done properly. So in summary, I'm just going to give a summary of what we talked about today. I'm going to summarize that from the outline. We started by talking about what qualitative synthesis is all about, some of the key terms, and like for narrative synthesis, what's it, what's thematic, what's coding, what does it mean, what's analytical, what are all these? What is the narrative synthesis process? We did explain that. The tools, same for thematic as well, the differences, AI automation, some of the limitations and benefits, the steps with summary exercises. So I'm sure we all want to get started with our own qualitative synthesis. We all want to just provide more rich information and insights in the data that we have, and also look at some of the necessary key terms and differences and knowing when to get started. So it's a pleasure to have you on this session. Yeah, I really want to say a very big thank you to each and every one of you who is making this session a very, very insightful one. And I want to say a very big thank you to everybody. Thank you and have a very nice day. Bye-bye.